I want to welcome today our guest speaker, Professor Eric Gidal of the English department, who's going to be talking about what's the title again?
Imagining Climate in the Age of Romanticism.
There we go. And, I thought I'd start by asking you, probably for a lot of members of the class, it's not intuitive to think of an English professor and environment and climate change. So talk to us a little bit about how you came to this from being someone who specializes in English literature.
I'm so glad you asked me that question. Yes, and actually that's what I was going to talk about initially here. Yeah, right, so I teach English literature, literally English literature, mostly 18th and early 19th century literature, the Age of Romanticism, which would seem on the face of it to have very little to do with climate change. It's literature written in a period before the kind of advent of the acceleration of burning of fossil fuels and most of the greenhouse gas emissions that we associate with climate change. You had mentioned the Natural History Museum, and behind the scenes at the Natural History Museum, they have all these wonderful archives. And one of the archives they have, I'm answering your question, is a whole bunch of field mice from Iowa. And field mice have been in Iowa for a long, long time, and they do just fine now, just as they did before when we had tall grass prairies, because they can eat corn just as well as they could eat the native grasses. But as they shifted over to industrial monoculture, the field mice, their bone density began to change. And so you can actually measure environmental change by looking at symptomatically this change in bone density. What does that have to do with literature? It's kind of how I start to think about literature. When you start to think about climate change or environmental history, you oftentimes look at literature as speaking to changes not necessarily directly or thematically, but symptomatically, that there are ways in which you can think about literature in relationship to climate change. A lot of times we think about climate change as a political question and a scientific question, but climate change is also something that we imagine. And we've actually been imagining climate change for thousands of years. And so literature and literary history can oftentimes bring us into the kind of history of the human imagination. And when we think about climate or when we think about any other question that we're dealing with today, a lot of times looking at the past, not simply for what has happened or how it's been scientifically understood, but how it's been imagined, can help us to recognize and orient our own patterns of imagination.
Cool. That's great. Last week we had a lecture by Steve Warren from History and American Studies, and I think towards the end of the lecture he said, this lecture is a synopsis of a whole course I'm teaching next semester. So let me ask you a little bit about courses you teach, if anybody finds this approach intriguing and would like to learn a little bit more.
Right. So I was telling you before we started, I have been teaching now for a number of years an undergraduate course on literature, the Anthropocene, and I don't want to talk about the Anthropocene right now, but it's also a course in 18th and 19th century literature that thinks about that literature in relationship to our contemporary environmental concerns. We look at poetry, we look at novels, we look at essays, again, not for ways of immediately speaking about our present moment, but for understanding the history of how we got here. Not only how we physically got here, but how we imagined ourselves in this state. So I teach that course pretty regularly. I'm taking a switch next year. I've been developing a somewhat similar course with Professor Barbara Eckstein, who's also in the English department, that's going to be part of the sustainability certificate. And it's going to be more wide-ranging, and we're going to go, in some sense, way far back, all the way to Virgil and the Georgics, and also much more to present-day environmental writing, but thinking again about how different literary artists have tried to imagine not simply climate change, but other elements of ecology, environment, and the airs, waters, and places in which we make our homes.
So I'm going to ask you one last question before handing things over. For those, I realize you don't want to think about the Anthropocene anymore.
Okay.
But for anyone in the class who might not be familiar with that term, it seems to me like a good one to wrap our minds around.
Okay, yeah, the Anthropocene. So I think it was back in 2000 or so, a number of folks were getting around, they were talking about the Holocene. The Holocene is the geological epoch in which we understand ourselves as existing ever since the melting of the glaciers about 12,000 years ago. But recently, a number of Earth scientists have suggested that we've now shifted into a new geological epoch, and they've named it the Anthropocene. And the idea is that the human impacts on the planet have been so great that they have achieved a kind of geological scale, so that we haven't simply been changing, say, the biosphere or the atmosphere. We've actually been changing the entire planetary system in a way that will leave recorded evidence, or signatures, as geologists like to say, in the rock record. So it's a kind of, in part, a mental game to imagine geologists millions of years from now coming to planet Earth, or should there still be geologists on planet Earth, would they be able to see that the anthropos, that humanity had actually been here? And the answer increasingly offered by earth scientists is yes, that we're leaving such dramatic changes to the chemistry and the makeup of our planet that will leave a noticeable signature in the rock, and that we really are no longer in the Holocene, but we're now really in a new geological epoch. Some people suggest that started after World War II, a great acceleration of consumption and population boom. Some people suggest it's coordinate with the Holocene, that it started as soon as we had agriculture, as soon as people began to settle down after the melting of the last glaciers. We already set these things in motion. But a lot of people date it to around 1800 and the advent of the Industrial Revolution. And as someone who studies literature from the late 18th to the early 19th century, I like that start date because it promises an interesting way of thinking about the literature that I'm most invested in.
Super. So I'm going to hand things over to Professor Gidal now. As usual, he will speak and present his presentation. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session, and I'll come to you with the mic.
Great. And I assume everybody can hear me because I can hear this mic talking. We already covered, actually, just with Lisa, some of the main initial points I wanted to make, which is why a literature professor, why a professor of English literary history is here talking to you about climate change. And I've put up these kind of book covers really just to give you a sense that I'm not the only one, that in fact there's quite a lot of people in the humanities who are very interested in the topic of climate change. It's a topic, obviously, that all of us as human beings have a great investment in, but particularly those of us who think about imaginative change and the ways in which human societies have altered over the years, we want to think about what are the contexts for literary production, what are the ways in which we imagine things. As I said, my own area is British literature of the 18th and 19th century, and I've given you a few titles here of people who are looking at the relationship that British writers had with the weather, with the climate, with the atmosphere in the 18th and in the 19th century. Everything from understanding the climate as causing a kind of national character of grumpiness and melancholy, to thinking more systematically about weather and weather changes. And there's just been a whole lot of really wonderful studies, and if this was a different kind of talk, I would go into that and give you a long survey of that. But I'm really just throwing up these titles up here to give you a sense, again, that when we talk about literature, when we look to literature for thinking about climate change, on the one hand, we might think about looking to literature for ethical guidance. We oftentimes look to writers for providing a kind of way of imagining different relationships that we might have with the planet, different relationships we might have with energy, different relations we might have with labor. But also we look historically at literature. We look at the ways in which previous centuries and previous cultures have written about, have tried to imagine the relationship of their existence to the climate that's around there. What I'm going to do today, though, is I'm not going to speak, I hope, in long, sweeping generalizations. I'm really actually going to just call our attention to two particular books to try to give you an example of the kind of reading practice that I'm interested in and why I think literary studies is so relevant to the question of climate change. And so I'm going to concentrate on two books. Both are from the early 19th century. Both are from this period we call the Age of Romanticism. A lot of times Romanticism, it means many different things, but the Age of Romanticism is generally associated with two great revolutions, with the French Revolution, the kind of political revolution that began to celebrate the individual rights of men and women, and the Industrial Revolution, which began to exponentially increase the ability of humans to produce and increasingly alter the world around them. So these are two books from that period. One is a poem, a book-length poem called Queen Mab by the British Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, husband to Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein. And the second is The Pioneers by the American author James Fenimore Cooper. And James Fenimore Cooper wrote The Pioneers in 1823. Shelley writes Queen Mab originally in 1813. So these are separated by around a decade. And I really just want to kind of do a little reading with you, just to introduce you to these books if you don't already know them, and to provide a little bit of a kind of intellectual context for what's going on. And let's see, is this There we go. I'm actually going to go in reverse chronology, though. I want to start with Cooper and the Pioneers. It's a really fascinating book, and there's endless things to say about it. I'm going to concentrate on the opening few pages. But James Fenimore Cooper was trying to do for America what Sir Walter Scott had done for Scotland and Great Britain, namely to write a series of national historical novels that would tell the history of a kind of growing nation through a sequence of exemplary vignettes. And The Pioneers was the first of James Fenimore Cooper's novels, and it takes place in this fictional town in upstate New York named Templeton. And as I said, I want to just focus on the first few pages of it, and I'm going to read a little bit to you. I'm not going to read all of this, don't worry, but I want to read the opening paragraph and a little bit of another paragraph, and I want us to just look at the way in which Cooper is opening this novel, in which he's trying to imagine the difference between Templeton. Again, it's a fictional town, but it's supposed to be exemplary of American towns in upstate New York in 1823. The difference between these towns now in the present, Cooper's present, and the end of the Revolution, 1783. So a 40-year difference. What has happened? How is not only this town, but how is the American Republic changing during this time? So let me just read you the very opening paragraph of this and call your attention to a few things. It's a great opening. I'm going to skip the epigraph. I'd love to tell you about the epigraph and Thomson's Seasons and the way in which individual kind of Georgic poetry is revived from Virgilian Latin traditions and brought to the 18th century, but that would be another talk. So here's the opening of the novel. Near the center of the state of New York lies an extensive district of country, whose surface is a succession of hills and dales, or, to speak with greater deference to geographical definitions, of mountains and valleys. It is among these hills that the Delaware takes its rise, and flowing from the limpid lakes and thousand springs of this region, the numerous sources of the Susquehanna meander through the valleys, until, uniting their streams, they form one of the proudest rivers of the United States. The mountains are generally arable to the tops, although instances are not wanting where the sides are jutted with rocks that aid greatly in giving to the country that romantic and picturesque character to which the country, that romantic and picturesque character which it so eminently possesses. The vales are narrow, rich, and cultivated, with a stream uniformly winding through each. Beautiful and thriving villages are found interspersed along the margins of the small lakes, or situated at those points of neat and comfortable, those points of the streams, which are favorable for manufacturing. And neat and comfortable farms, with every indication of wealth about them, are scattered profusely through the vales and even to the mountain tops. Roads diverge in every direction, from the even and graceful bottoms of the valleys to the most rugged and intricate passes of the hills. Academies and minor edifices of learning meet the eye of the stranger at every few miles as he winds his way through this uneven territory, and places for the worship of God abound with that frequency which characterize a moral and reflecting people, and with that variety of exterior and canonical government which flows from unfettered liberty of conscience. In short, the whole district is hourly exhibiting how much can be done in even a rugged country and with a severe climate under the dominion of mild laws, and where every man feels a direct interest in the prosperity of a commonwealth of which he knows himself to form a part. The expedients of the pioneers who first broke ground in the settlement of this country are succeeded by the permanent improvements of the yeoman who intends to leave his remains to molder under the sod which he tills, or perhaps of the son who, born in the land, piously wishes to linger around the grave of his father. Only 40 years have passed since this territory was a wilderness. That's lovely writing, at least if you have a taste for this kind of thing. It's very picturesque, literally like a picture. He's trying to help you imagine this kind of setting. And notice the way in which this is very much a kind of non-neutral description. That is to say, he's trying to make a point. He's trying to celebrate the cultivation of this wilderness into a civilized country. There's beauty in nature, but it's a beauty in which humanity very much has a part, in which the farms and the villages and the houses of worship are all part of this larger harmonious picture. But what I want to call your attention to is that word climate, which is of course our topic for this class, and notice the difference, or rather the distinction, that Cooper is drawing between a severe climate and mild laws. Right? Let me read that sentence again, just so we have that in our heads. How much can be done in a rugged country and with a severe climate under the dominion of mild laws? And in Cooper's idea, the severity of the climate, that is to say the cold in the winter and the heat in the summer, is modified by the laws, by the way in which this government, this idealized American republic, is providing everyone a certain freedom of conscience and labor. Now, in and of itself, that's just a kind of passing reference. But I also want to call attention to what happens a couple paragraphs later, when finally, after all of this description, Cooper begins to introduce his main characters as they approach this town. And this is at the very bottom of this page, on to the next. It was near the setting of the sun, on a clear, cold day in December, when a sleigh was moving slowly up one of the mountains in the district we have described. The day had been fine for the season, and but 2 or 3 large clouds, whose color seemed brightened by the light reflected from the mass of snow that covered the earth, floated in a sky of the purest blue. The road wound along the brow of a precipice, and on one side was upheld by a foundation of logs piled one upon the other, while a narrow excavation in the mountain in the opposite direction had made a passage of sufficient width for the ordinary traveling of that day. But logs, excavation, and everything that did not reach several feet above the earth lay alike buried beneath the snow. A single track, barely wide enough to receive the sleigh, denoted the route of the highway, and this was sunk nearly 2 feet below the surrounding surface. Now I'm going to stop there, because what I really want to call our attention to is the footnote that Cooper inserts to explain his use of the word sleigh. And keep in mind, again, this is a novel published in 1823. This is what he says in the footnote. Sleigh is the word used in every part of the United States to denote a tonneau. It is of local use in the west of England, whence it is most probably derived by the Americans. The latter draw a distinction between a sled or sledge and a sleigh, the sleigh being shod with metal. Sleighs are also subdivided into 2-horse and 1-horse sleighs. Of the latter, there are the cutter, with thrills so arranged so as to permit the horse to travel in the side track, the pung or towpung, which is driven with a pole, and the gumper, a rude construction used for temporary purposes in the new country. That's probably more than any of you ever wanted to know about sleighs, but he's giving us that information. Many of the American sleighs are elegant, though the use of this mode of conveyance is much lessened with the melioration of the climate consequent on the clearing of the forests. And it's, of course, that last qualification that provides the main interest and my main kind of avenue into the opening of this novel. What is going on here? It's as though that contrast between the severity of the climate and the mildness of the laws, which is a kind of idealization in Cooper's opening of the landscape, is now being turned into history. And we're to understand that the climate itself, formerly severe, is now being meliorated, made more mild by the clearing of the forests. The clearing of the forests, of course, is part of the grand kind of westward expansion. At this point, the westward expansion is simply into upstate New York. And Cooper needs to explain to his audience not only what he means by the word sleigh, but also suggest that his readers in 1823 are going to be much less familiar with these because there's much less snow, because the winters have become much less mild. So I put up some reading, and I don't know if people did it or not, but this is actually not so unique to Cooper. In fact, this is part of a large discussion of the melioration of the climate that went on in the early Americas in the 18th and the early 19th century. One of the readings I posted for us to look at today was an essay on the alteration of the climate in Pennsylvania in 1772. And it's typical of a discourse that's been most recently described by this book that just came out in 2016, A Temperate Empire, Making Climate Change in America by Anya Zilberstein. And Zilberstein studies in more depth what a number of historians have looked at in the past, namely, again, this fascination with the North American continent by primarily British, but in fact many other European writers as well, as a kind of testing ground for the ability of culture and cultivation to change the climate. Here's a little passage from that essay on the alteration of the climate in Pennsylvania. We may rationally conclude, writes the author, that in a series of years, when the virtuous industry of posterity shall have cultivated the interior part of this country, we shall seldom be visited by frosts or snows, but may enjoy such a temperature in the midst of winter as shall hardly destroy the most tender plants. A considerable change in the temperature of our seasons may one day oblige the tobacco planter to migrate towards the Carolinas and Florida, which will be the natural retreat of that plant, when the seasons admonish the Virginian to cultivate wheat and Indian corn. The tender vine, which would now be destroyed by our winter's frosts, in a few years shall supply the North American with every species of wine. Posterity, that is to say our descendants, will doubtless transplant the several odoriferous, aromatic, and medicinal plants of the eastern countries, he's thinking of Asia, which must flourish in one or another part of North America, where they will find a climate and soil favorable to their growth as that of their native country. Pleuritic and other inflammatory fevers with the several diseases of cold seasons are also observed to remit their violence as our winters grow more temperate. Now, what you should notice here is not only this kind of uncanny understanding that human cultivation of the land is not only going to change the physical terrain, but is going to change the atmosphere and also the climate, but the positive mode in which that is understood. For the writer of this essay, the changing of the climate is all to the better. It's going to allow North Americans to grow a much wider variety of crops. It's going to make the diseases that we associate with cold weather less severe. And it's going to bring out generally a much more temperate, mild, and habitable climate. There are many examples of this. I just want to share two more with you. These are also from Zilberstein's book. This first one is from Edward Long, a free and candid view of a tract entitled Observations on the Commerce of the American States from 1784. We shall probably be told that so far as regards the physical maladies of climate, we are to hope that in process of time, when the atmosphere of these regions shall be more impregnated with phlogistic particles from myriads of reeking dunghills, that's an old term for smog, basically, from the fumes of furnaces, from the fires and smoke of 10,000 crowded cities hereafter to be built, and by a general subjection of the soil to agriculture carried on to the Arctic Circle, they may be considerably alleviated. That's great. We're going to not only expand agriculture, we're going to expand cities, and they're going to create all sorts of smoke, and it's going to change the climate all the way up to the Arctic Circle. Thank goodness. Everything's going to be much more habitable once we do this. We won't have to deal with the severity of the cold. It's going to be, as the writer says, considerably alleviated. I want to read you this next one from Samuel Williams. Again, notice the positive tone, and notice also the faith that this is part of a kind of inevitable progress of human culture and civilization well past the United States. Samuel Williams, in his Change of Climate in North America and Europe, 1789, writes, "The whole earth is less subject to extreme cold than it was formerly." The whole earth. And that every climate has become more temperate and uniform and equal, and that this will continue to be the case so long as diligence, industry, and agriculture shall mark the conduct of mankind. Diligence, industry, and agriculture will bring about climate change. And what we're seeing in these kinds of quotes is a kind of prehistory of that odd little footnote at the beginning of Cooper's Pioneers. And in all of them, there's not only the sense that humans are able to change the climate, but that humans should change the climate, and that doing so is both a consequence of human progress and to the benefit of humanity. It's a faith in human progress that sees climate change not as a problem, but as evidence of humanity's ability to tame the extremities of the earth. So, as you can tell from Zilberstein's book, there's a lot of examples of this, but this is actually an older idea than just the 18th century. It goes all the way back to antiquity, and I just am bringing up this book for you just as a kind of way of noting that. This is an amazing book that was written in 1967 by a man named Clarence Glacken, and it's called Traces on the Rhodian Shore. And the title of it is a little enigmatic, and so I've put up here the anecdote that explains it. It is said of the Socratic philosopher Aristippus, so Vitruvius wrote in the preface to the 6th book of his De Architectura that being shipwrecked and cast on the shore of Rhodes and seeing their geometrical figures on the sand, he cried out to his companions, "Let us be of good hope, for indeed I see the traces of men." And that idea of being comforted by seeing the traces of humanity in the wilderness is the title of this idea of traces on the Rhodian shore. Glacken gave traces two concurrent intellectual traditions, again, that go all the way back to antiquity and that are manifest in these examples of climate change in America that I've just shared with you. One is this idea of environmental determinism. This is an idea that human beings, not only as individuals, but as collectives, are shaped by their environments, including the climate. And as an example, Glacken gives us this passage from Hippocrates, Airs, Waters, and Places. Hippocrates writes, "I hold that Asia Minor differs very widely from Europe in the nature of all its inhabitants and all of its vegetation. For everything in Asia grows to far greater beauty and size. The one region is less wild than the other. The character of the inhabitants is milder and more gentle. The cause of this is the temperate climate, because it lies towards the east, midway between the risings of the sun and farther away than is Europe from the cold." It's a wild idea. From Hippocrates' idea is that we're familiar with the idea of ecosystems, right? That certain plants, certain animals, certain terrains will flourish within certain climates. He says it's also true of people, not only individuals, but societies. And that it's possible to understand the nature of human societies by simply thinking about elements of their environment. And so when he's comparing Asia Minor to Europe, he compares it in terms of a difference of climate that has an effect upon the people. So this is this idea of environmental determinism, but we can also think of it as simply climatic determinism. We are the products of the climate in which we live. But this is coexistent with another tradition that goes all the way back to antiquity, which is the idea of humanity as a modifier of the environment, humanity as a changer of climates. And he gives here an example from Cicero. "We enjoy the fruits of the plains and of the mountains. The rivers and the lakes are ours. We sow corn. We plant trees. We fertilize the soil by irrigation. We confine the rivers and straighten or divert their courses. In fine, by means of our hands, we essay to create, as it were, a second world within the world of nature." So whereas environmental determinism suggests that we are kind of passive consequences of the environment in which we live, the idea of humans as modifiers of the environment says we can change that environment, we can change that climate. And so it's a kind of two-way street of causation between humans, individuals, and societies, and the climates and the environments in which they live. You'll notice the subtitle of Glacken's book is Nature and Culture in Western Thought from Ancient Times to the End of the 18th Century. And I'm just going to skip us right to the end of that part, the end of the 18th century, because these ideas come back with a vengeance in the 18th century as a lot of thinkers in what we now refer to as the Enlightenment tried to understand the wide variety of cultures that they were encountering, not only in far-flung discoveries, but simply within Europe and even within European countries and nation states. And one of the kind of most influential proponents of this idea, again, this is this idea of climatic determinism, environmental determinism, was the Baron de Montesquieu, who wrote this amazingly large tome in 1748 called The Spirit of the Laws. And Montesquieu's main point was to suggest that there is no universal standard for law. There is no standard institution that is correct for all cultures and all societies. He was a kind of proponent of what we now call cultural relativism. Each society, each culture will develop their own laws and institutions that are proper to them. But all of them, Montesquieu argued, are subject to climate. The empire of the climate is the first, the most powerful of all empires, he wrote. And as a consequence, what one had to attend to as one was trying to think about different institutions and laws is what is the nature of the people who live there? And to understand that, you had to think about what the nature of the climate is. If it be true, Montesquieu writes, that the temper of the mind and the passions of the heart are extremely different in different climates, the laws ought to be relative both to the variety of those passions and to the variety of those tempers. So different laws, different ideals of liberty, of free association, of rule, of systems of government are going to be proper for different cultures depending on their environmental determinations. Montesquieu made then climate a kind of premise for thinking about comparative laws. Madame de Staël, who wrote about a half century later, also in France, made it a premise for thinking about literature and artistic expression, and was trying to understand the difference between German literature and French literature and English literature and Italian literature, and from her perspective, it all came down to climate. This is just an example of her thinking. The climate, she writes, is certainly one of the principal causes of difference which existed between the images that pleased in the north and those which were admired in the east. The reveries of poets may produce extraordinary objects, but the impressions of the habits are necessary in their compositions of every kind. So these are just examples of this kind of strain of thinking that suggested that not only our laws and our governments are dependent upon the climate, but so too is our literature, so too is our cultural productions, our theater, our art, and our poetry. It's a truism of 18th century studies that anything the French promote, the British attack, and that's the case here as well. And I'm going to give you a portrait from this lovely gentleman. This is Samuel Johnson. I forgot to fill in the date. I think it's 1756. In his Idler essay, Samuel Johnson is kind of the patron saint of English professors, and you can, looking at him, you can see why. And he thought this whole idea of climatic determinism was a crock. And here, just to give you a sense of his reasoning. There are, he writes, among the numerous lovers of subtleties and paradoxes, some who derive the civil institutions of every country from its climate, who impute freedom and slavery to the temperature of the air, can fix the meridian of vice and virtue, and tell at what degree of latitude we are to expect courage or timidity, knowledge or ignorance. And you can tell just by the way he characterizes this, his skepticism. Surely nothing is more reproachful to a being endowed with reason than to resign its powers to the influence of the air and live in dependence on the weather and the wind for the only blessings which nature has put into our power, tranquility and benevolence. To look up to the sky for the nutriment of our bodies is the condition of nature. To call upon the sun for peace and gaiety, or deprecate the clouds lest sorrow should overwhelm us, is the cowardice of idleness and the idolatry of folly. Notice how nature is a pejorative here, right? To be dependent upon the weather, to be dependent upon the climate, is to give in to natural forces. It's to be cowardly and to be idle. Johnson suggests instead we can use our minds, we can use our reason to make us, as he says here, superior to the seasons. The distinction of seasons is produced only by imagination operating on luxury. To temperance, every day is bright, and every hour is propitious to diligence. He that shall resolutely excite his faculties or exert his virtues will soon make himself superior to the seasons, and may set at defiance the morning mist, and the evening damp, and the blasts of the easts, and the clouds of the south. Lovely, right? If you just think, if you just have enough courage, if you just have enough determination, if you just use your reason, you will make yourself superior to the seasons. So this is the idea of human reason as superior, as a counteractive to nature and to climate. A more poetic and imaginative version of this is given to us by the English Romantic poet about 50 years after Johnson, William Wordsworth, in his preface to Lyrical Ballads. And Wordsworth is not so much focusing on reason as he is on imagination. And listen to how he positions poetic imagination in relationship to climate. In spite of difference of soil and climate, of language and manners, of laws and customs, and you can hear there again, right, that language of Montesquieu, that there are all sorts of differences that are determined by our manners, by our customs, by our climate, by our soil. But in spite of all that, in spite of things silently gone out of mind and things violently destroyed, the poet binds together by passion and knowledge the vast empire of human society as it is spread over the whole earth and over all time. So Montesquieu says that the empire of climate is everything. Wordsworth says, no, actually, the empire of poetry and poetic imagination is everything. So what I'm giving you here then is a kind of context again for thinking about that odd little note in Cooper for why it is that human industry, human activity, human diligence, human imagination is understood at this time as a kind of counterpoint to climate. But Wordsworth and Johnson and Madame de Staël Montesquieu, well, Montesquieu's an exception, as I'm about to show you, they're not thinking about climate change. To them, climate is a static condition, and humans are what change. We can somehow elevate ourselves above the limitations of climate. But at the same period, many writers, including Montesquieu, were beginning to think about our ability to change the climate itself. So here's just a few examples from Montesquieu again. Men, by their care and their good laws, have made the earth more fit to be their home. We see rivers flowing where there were lakes and marshes. It is a good that nature did not make, but which is maintained by nature. Just as destructive nations do evil things that last longer themselves, there are industrious nations that do good things that do not end with themselves. We have the ability to change nature. Or this from Rousseau. Again, they're all kind of classic writers of the 18th century Enlightenment. Rousseau writes, "This is why the ancient distinctions of race, the effect of soil and climate," there again we have that Hippocratic idea, "this is why those ancient distinctions made a greater difference between nation and nation in respect of temperament, looks, and manners and character than can be distinguished in our own time, when the fickleness of Europe leaves no time for natural causes to work, when the forests are cut down and the marshes drained, and when the earth is more generally, though less thoroughly tilled, so that the same differences between country and country can no longer be detected, even in purely physical features." All of those distinctions of climate belong to the past. Now that we're clearing the forests and draining the marshes, those distinctions between people are much less severe. Again, notice how Rousseau takes an idea that is present from antiquity and turns it into a matter of human progress, where before we were subject to climate, now in fact we can alter the climate ourselves. And this quote from the German philosopher Herder, this is a fascinating quote to me, again, particularly in the context of our present environmental circumstances. Herder writes, "The face of Egypt would have been nothing more than the slime of the Nile, but for the art and policy of man. He has gained it from the flood, and both there and in farther Asia, the living creation has adapted itself to the artificial climate. We may consider mankind, therefore, as a band of bold though diminutive giants, gradually descending from the mountains to subjugate the earth and change climates with their feeble arms. How far they are capable of going in this respect, futurity will show." Truer words were never spoken, right? But here we are, over 200 years ago, a German philosopher simply trying to think about the course of humanity as a course of climate change, and understanding that we are bold but diminutive giants. Each of us individually is, of course, incapable of changing the climate, but collectively, humanity is changing the climate. And again, from Herder's perspective, all to the better. How far they'll take it, futurity will show. And this idea reached a kind of utopian apotheosis during the French Revolution and the Romantic period. And I want to read you one more quote before we turn to that second book I told you I wanted to think about. And this is from the French medical writer Candide on the relations between the physical and moral aspects of man. "The state of the soil," Candide writes, "and some of its products, the direction and even the use of a certain part of its waters, their nature insofar as it depends on their direction, the nature of the vapors that rise from the earth or from the waters, and consequently also the state of the air, in a word, the climate itself, can, at least in some respects, and in the above-mentioned limits, be modified by the hand of man. This is what an active and wise industry has truly created in some regions whose inhospitable nature seem to make living conditions impossible, both for the human race and for the species of docile animals that we have made into the instruments of our needs. But where courage, persistence, and that kind of energy that is consonant only with liberty have created for themselves artificial sources of wealth and happiness." The difference here, it's slight but important, whereas these earlier writers such as Rousseau and Herder are already admitting that humanity is changing the climate and that this is part of an almost inevitable progress. From Candide's perspective, this can be part of an intentional and systematic engineering, an ability to think about how one wants to change the climate and to intentionally change things in the soil, change things in the topography to bring about these kind of climatic changes. And it's part of this kind of utopian fervor that surrounded the French Revolution, that humanity could remake itself, not only by revolutionizing its political institutions, and not only by revolutionizing its cultural institutions, but by revolutionizing the climate itself. And so we get then finally to the second book that I want to just dwell on as by way of conclusion, which is this book, Queen Mab, by the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, who was a lovely radical poet. He got kicked out of college for writing a treatise on the defense of atheism. He celebrated free love, sexual liberation, and political anarchy. He was a really fun guy to hang around with. And Queen Mab was his first major poem. It was published originally in 1813 and then republished time and time again throughout the 19th century and taken as a kind of poetic Bible for all sorts of radical politics, mostly related actually to workers' struggles and class struggles during the long 19th century. It involves this maiden who you can see here lying there, Ianthe, who falls asleep and is guided on a tour of the cosmos by Queen Mab, the fairy Queen Mab, who's borrowed from Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. She takes the spirit Ianthe on a tour of the cosmos, shows her all the principles of the universe, but primarily gives her a tour of the history of the human race. And the history of the human race is one of unmitigated misery, according to Queen Mab, mostly the faults of kings, priests, and statesmen. So basically organized religion and organized political government, from Shelley's perspective, voiced through Queen Mab, is the root of all problems. And we go through canto after canto after canto of Queen Mab, and we're shown this very systematically. But as we get towards the end of the poem, we get an alternative. We get a view of the future as shown by Queen Mab, and it's that I want to dwell on. I'm just going to read you a little poetry. This is, again, the sixth part of Queen Mab, as Queen Mab begins to comfort the fairy. And I'm just going to read the opening, and we're going to look at one more footnote. All touch, all eye, all ear. The spirit felt the fairy's burning speech, or the thin texture of its frame, the varying periods painted changing glows, as on a summer even, when soul-enfolding music floats around. The stainless mirror of the lake re-images the eastern gloom, mingling convulsively its purple hues with sunset's burnished gold. Then thus the spirit spoke. It is a wild and miserable world, thorny and full of care, which every fiend can make his prey at will. O fairy, in the lapse of years, is there no hope in store? Will yon vast suns roll on interminably, still illuming the night of so many wretched souls, and see no hope for them? Will not the universal spirit e'er revivify this withered limb of heaven? The fairy calmly smiled. In comfort and a kindling gleam of hope suffused the spirit's lineaments. Oh, rest thee tranquil. Chase those fearful doubts, which ne'er could rack an everlasting soul that sees the chains which bind it to its doom. Yes, crime and misery are in yonder earth, falsehood, mistake, and lust. But the eternal world contains at once the evil and the cure. Some eminent in virtue shall start up, even in perversest times. The truth of their pure lips that never die shall bind the scorpion falsehood with a wreath of ever-living flame, until the monster sting itself to death. How sweet a scene will earth become, of purest spirits a pure dwelling place, symphonious with the planetary spheres, when man, with changeless nature coalescing, will undertake regeneration's work, when its ungenial poles no longer point to the red and baleful sun that faintly twinkles there. It's a beautiful vision, but what I really want to attend to again is the note that Shelley provides to those final lines, to the red and baleful sun that faintly twinkles there. Here's what Shelley writes. The North Polar Star, to which the axis of the Earth in its present state of obliquity points, it is the exceedingly probable, from many considerations, that this obliquity will gradually diminish until the equator coincides with the ecliptic. The nights and days will then become equal on the Earth throughout the year, and probably the seasons also. Quick note to note. What is he talking about here? This is the idea that the Earth, which right now its axes are not perpendicular to the ecliptic, but in fact are off on a degree, hence we have the seasons, that gradually, according to Shelley, the Earth is rotating back to a kind of perpendicular condition. So he's imagining a future state in which seasonal variation will be eliminated. That's what he's talking about. I want to get back to his note real quickly. There is no great extravagance in presuming that the progress of the perpendicularity of the poles may be as rapid as the progress of intellect, or that there should be a perfect identity between the moral and physical improvement of the human species. So that again, that progression of the globe back to a perpendicular with its ecliptic will be part of a gradual progression of humanity to a state of equality and freedom. It is certain that wisdom is not compatible with disease, and that in the present state of the climates of the earth, health, in the true and comprehensive sense of the word, is out of reach of civilized man. Astronomy teaches us that the earth is now in its progress, and that the poles are every year becoming more and more perpendicular to the ecliptic. The strong evidence afforded by the history of mythology and geological researches that some event of this nature has taken place already affords a strong presumption that this progress is not merely an oscillation, as has been surmised by some late astronomers. Bones of animals peculiar to the torrid zone have been found in the north of Siberia and on the banks of the river Ohio. Plants have been found in the fossil state in the interior of Germany, which demand the present climate of Hindustan for their production. The researches of Monsieur Bally established the existence of a people who inhabited a tract in Tartary 49 degrees north latitude of greater antiquity than either the Indians, the Chinese, or the Chaldeans, from whom these nations derived their sciences and theology. We find from the testimony of ancient writers that Britain, Germany, and France were much colder than at present, and that their great rivers were annually frozen over. Astronomy teaches us also that since this period, the obliquity of the Earth's position has been considerably diminished. So from Shelley's perspective, all the evidence that's around of climate change in the past is part of a gradual progress of the Earth, moving towards this perpendicularity. He takes this from a long tradition, actually, of kind of theologically minded Earth history that I don't want to get into because I'm aware that I've already been speaking for quite some time. But he does find precedent in his poetic hero, John Milton. And in Milton's Paradise Lost, consequent upon the sin of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he narrates the Earth shifting off of the perpendicularity back to this condition. In other words, that the extremities and severities of the climate, according to Milton, are part of man's sinful state. But from Shelley's perspective, human progress and regeneration are going to bring about a new planet in which the climate change and human progress and intellect have achieved almost kind of utopian proportions. Just read you a little sample of this and then bring this to conclusion. From the very bottom of this first page I have up here, the habitable earth is full of bliss. Those wastes of frozen billows that were hurled by everlasting snowstorms round the poles, where matter dared not vegetate or live, but ceaseless frost round the vast solitude, bound its broad zone of stillness, are unloosed. And fragrant zephyrs there from spicy isles ruffle the placid ocean deep, that rolls its broad, bright surges to the sloping sand, whose roar is wakened into echoing sweet, to murmur through the heaven-breathing groves and melodize with man's blessed nature there. These days, when we hear about the melting of the Arctic ice and the kind of record-breaking warmth in the northern latitudes, we're filled with a sense of dread. In Shelley's poem, the melting of the ice sheets is part of, as he says, man's blessed nature, finding a kind of planetary apotheosis. There are many more lines of this poetry, but I do want to bring my talk to a conclusion. So I just want to then get back to this idea of why an English professor has anything to say about climate change. When you look at these two books, one from 1813, one from 1823, we see a way of not only thinking about climate change and not only explaining climate change, but imagining climate change. And imagining climate change as part of a grander story about human progress. In Cooper, it's simply part of a kind of gradual cultivation of the North American wilderness and mild laws that guaranteed each of us our liberty. For Shelley, it's part of a kind of revolutionary transformation of humanity, as well as the environments that have so far restrained us. So one we might say is giving us a kind of poetics or a novel of progress, that's Cooper, and the other is giving us the kind of poetry of utopian revolution. But in both of them, imagining climate change is intimately involved in imagining changes in human society, and in both cases is very much a positive. So we can move from kind of classical antiquity to the new American empire, and then on to our present age, where we have people like Diane Ackerman in her book, The Human Age, this came out in 2014, The World Shaped by Us, offering a very similar way of imagining these kinds of transformations. And you'll hear Herder most distinctly here in what Ackerman is saying. Like supreme beings, we are now present everywhere and in everything. We've colonized or left our fingerprints on every inch of the planet, from the ocean sediment to the exosphere, the outermost fringe of atmosphere where molecules escape into space, junk careens and satellites orbit. Nearly all of the wonders we identify with modern life emerged in just the past 2 centuries. And over the past couple of decades, like a giant boulder racing ahead of a landslide, the human adventure has accelerated at an especially mind-bending pace. And I kind of gave away my punchline, but we see this kind of imagining as well in the present director of the EPA, Scott Pruitt, who says that global warming may help humans flourish. He says there are assumptions made that because the climate is warming, that is necessarily a bad thing. We know humans have most flourished during times of warming trends. There are assumptions made that because the climate is warming, that necessarily is a bad thing. And so my aim here then is to, and I'm going to skip my little section on Keats and just get us back to this image of these 2 books, is simply to think about how a study of literary history can help us understand that these ways of imagining climate change also themselves have a rather deep history. And I think I'll stop at this point and see if there's questions or a conversation we might have. So thank you for your attention.
Invite questions from the audience.
Yeah. Oh, the mic. Right.
Helpful for the videographers.
From your talk, it kind of came across as this is like a very hopeful age in terms of like how human progress can affect the world and stuff like that. I was just curious as to when you start seeing that change, that it's no longer human progress is kind of seen as a bad thing. Almost.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, one of the other terms for the 18th century is the Age of Optimism, and you do have enormous amounts of optimistic fervor at the time. There's also a fair amount of skepticism at that time as well. One of the most famous examples is Voltaire's novella Candide. I don't know if people are familiar with that, in which Candide is told that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and he takes a kind of tour of human living from all walks of life and realizes that everybody is completely miserable and it's a complete disaster. But he's being told again and again satirically that we live in a kind of wonderful age. So there are kind of skeptical strains during this same period as well. What's interesting is that for the most part, the question of climate change tends to come up much more in the optimists. And so where you have climate and climate change being most explicitly discussed during the 18th century and early Romantic period, it's primarily by those who are trying to give a sense of the positive. But there is a negative, and I guess it's coordinated. One example I would give you is actually Cooper himself. Because there's another famous kind of environmental scene in The Pioneers where they go out and they begin shooting all these skylarks that are all around. And they start hunting them. They're waiting, they're migrating in the thousands, and the people in Templeton go out and just start blasting away and just slaughtering these things. And it's quite clear in the context of the novel that this is a deplorable waste. And something to be bemoaned. And in fact, there's a lot of loss that goes on over the course of the pioneers. We see a lot of not only native indigenous ways of life, but early pioneer ways of life giving way to civilization and culture. So Cooper's vision is not even itself entirely optimistic. That's a more question about its general tone, but perhaps you're also asking when do people start thinking of climate change itself as something to be particularly anxious about. There again, over the course of the 19th century, as the kind of effects of industrialization on the atmosphere and the air become more and more prominent, we see increasingly bleak descriptions of atmospheric change. And one of the big examples that's often pointed to, John Ruskin, who's an art critic during the Victorian period, writes this essay called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century. And using very unscientific but quite poetically evocative means, he's quite aware that something radically is different. And he starts thinking about the glaciers in the Alps as actually being very susceptible to transformation and has a deeper sense of ominous premonition. So I'd say that one could start to chart over the course of the long 19th century increasing trepidation around the effects and the consequences and even the costs of these kind of human progress. Is that a helpful initial answer? Yeah.
Around this time at the sort of early part of America, there was also the rise of American Transcendentalism, which was sort of in contrast to this idea of industrialization being a really great thing. You have Emerson and Thoreau talking about the way that they're seeing these beautiful rivers already tainted by mills and things that are cropping up, and there's this real pushback, and there's a dawn of a connection of civilized and thoughtful people being connected to nature. And Emerson in particular, in his essay, Nature, talks about his connection. Did any of that have anything to do with a pushback against this, or is that,
Yeah, I'd say that a proper answer would need it to be a little more nuanced than just pushback. I showed you Wordsworth earlier, who's talking about poetic imagination as being kind of transcendent of imagination. And Wordsworth starts articulating similar things for his area, the Lake District in northern England, that Emerson and Thoreau are talking about in New England. He's also seeing the intrusions of industry and deploring some of the kind of transformations that he's seeing, and begins to elevate nature with a capital N as something to be highly valued. One of the things you see going on already in the writers here is a movement from nature as something that's deplorable, like you see in Johnson. I was making that point. You say, well, if you're susceptible to the seasons, you're allowing nature to control you. Nature there is a kind of negative. Already by the Romantics, by Wordsworth and Shelley, we're seeing nature given an enormous value as something quite positive. And certainly, as you just pointed out, by the time you get to Emerson and his essay Nature, or Thoreau and his meditations, you see increasingly a valuation of something that's increasingly perceived as being threatened. So one way to think about maybe a kind of century-long move from the middle of the 18th century to the middle of the 19th century, when we have Emerson and Thoreau, is that the contrast between nature and culture is something that all of these writers are thinking about. But whereas some of the earlier writers, some of the more optimistic writers of the Enlightenment, are suggesting that what we're witnessing is the ability of culture to transcend nature, over the course of about a century, which is the century of the early advent of the Industrial Revolution, that contrast is there, but now the concern is, can nature itself begin to overcome or at least escape some of the greater trepidations of culture?
Additional questions? This may take a little bit, beyond your area of specialization, but, I'm struck by the way that you're, of course, looking very much at the places that was really sort of the heart of the Industrial Revolution, right? Do we see these kinds of concerns coming either at a different time or being treated very differently in places that are a little bit more on the periphery of Northern Europe, England, the Eastern Seaboard of the United States?
The easy answer is yes, and the second easy answer is I can't go into much detail because, you say, it's taking me a little out of my territory. One of the interesting things is this is one of the interesting things about kind of coming to one's awareness as an English professor at this time in this place, is that as someone like me who's specialized in what we now think is pretty canonical Northern European and Eastern North American literature, you realize that that's the literature that followed directly the industrialization of the planet, and that these are some of the epicenters of some of the industrial changes that now, of course, are a global phenomenon. Inevitably, industrialization meets with different, more localized traditions, literary traditions and cultural traditions, and will manifest itself in different ways. But the writers who I've been talking about today were quite influential well beyond just their immediate realm. And when we think about the Enlightenment and its emphasis on rational engineering, and when we think on Romanticism and its emphasis on both a kind of elegiac mourning for a lost nature, as well as a kind of proactive and even kind of revolutionary resistance to some of the tyrannies of mechanical thought, I think you see strains of what we might think of as Enlightenment and Romantic writing in a number of other literary traditions. That's a bit vague, I recognize, but I would suggest that in some sense, even though what I'm giving is, from our contemporaries' perspective, a rather provincial look, that is to say, simply looking at the articulations of a certain group of Northwestern European thinkers, that this really is the heart of a lot of the technological and industrial changes that now numerous cultures around the world are having to contend with. Yeah.
Let me bring the microphone over for
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
So, it seems like all of the authors that you talked about were very concerned about the cold and how that was something they wanted to become milder. And they even spoke of Asia and called it a temperate place. It's more beautiful because it's warmer there, it doesn't get as cold. But it gets so warm in Asia that people die. Is there any literature maybe written by people who had traveled, or?
Oh yeah, there's quite a lot, and quite a lot of explorers and early colonial administrators. Again, thinking from a British perspective, people involved with the East Indies, Dutch East India Company, and the British in India are very much thinking about the extremities of the warmth of Asia, and particularly in South Asia. Excuse me. And you see a similar concern there about how climate might be modified in some cases, and witnessing some of the ways in which some of those kind of climatic extremes might be modified. But you find the question of climate change per se a little bit more persistent in the North American context, partly because it's understood as a kind of new settlement, that actually we want to have large-scale population movement over there. Whereas with a lot of the colonial administrators in Asia, there's less a question of trying to move people wholesale over there and more simply to try to kind of administer what's going on. But one of the interesting things we find, and this wonderful guy, Richard Grove, wrote a book about this, is that some of these colonial administrators, both in Africa and India, begin to observe the effects of deforestation and other radical transformations of the landscape on microclimates. And they begin to write, as part of their kind of colonial administrative reports, the fact that certain islands in the Indian Ocean are having radical changes in rainfall and temperature. And they begin speculating about this as a potentially global phenomenon. They see these islands as kind of climate models for a much larger, and this is contemporary with the literature I was just surveying today. And they begin to warn about that as a potential problem. They're viewing it primarily in terms of a problem for colonial administrators, right? If there's less rainfall, these islands are going to be less productive agriculturally. But they also do begin to speculate that this might be indicative of a larger connection between human activity and climate change.
Additional questions? You know, the subject of colonial administration and sort of imagined contrasts between northern climate and tropics, where particularly colonial administrators were, you know, very concerned with malaria and, you know, some of what they would have seen as kind of what they would have understood as to be sort of a negative side of warmth and
Right.
humidity. I wonder if, you know, thinking about the literature you're looking at, are there ways in which you see voiced in this senses of cultural or racial or ethnic sort of superiority, either stemming from, gee, you know, Northern Europeans have a cold climate that's made us hardy, or we're the ones who are altering the climate, others aren't, and thus they're not as advanced. I mean, how do you,
Yeah, both of
how,
them.
how do we think about this
Yes.
in those contexts?
I barely kept my talk to 50 minutes, but there's a very dark and pernicious side of all this environmental determinism, all the way back to Hippocrates. He's claiming on the one hand, this is, you got to remember, a Greek writer writing about the Persians, and he's saying on the one hand, well, they have a milder climate, they have kind of, it's an easier life for them, and as a consequence, he says, well, they allow themselves to be tyrannized because they're just, as long as they have enough to eat and enough wine to drink, anyone can rule over them. And this is a motif that comes up again and again. Not so much a racialized question, but certainly a kind of cultural prejudice. The people who live in warmer climates tend to live in tyrannical governments and tend not to have as much of a love of freedom. People who live in extremely northern climates, so the theory goes, are completely desensitized to any human cessations and are essentially barbarians. But the ideal climate is a temperate climate, which coincidentally tends to be exactly where the author of whatever tract we're talking about happens to live. So from the French perspective, it's the French who live in a perfectly temperate climate. From the British perspective, it's the British. You even have some Italians arguing that no, it's really down in the Italian peninsula. So there's certainly a kind of cultural prejudice. It does lend itself to certain kind of increasingly racialized ideas as well by the 19th century. But then climate starts to factor less, and you get into other kind of questions of spurious theories of kind of biology and genetics. Your other question was, yes, right, who actually changes the climate? So part of the idea is that if you live in a sufficiently northern climate that's difficult enough without turning you into a complete barbarian, you can struggle against that climate. And in the process of struggling against that climate and learning how to change and to modify it, you'll develop your culture. And so the idealized culture, that's why, going back to that quote I gave you from Herder about humanity as kind of diminutive giants, or that recent quote from Diane Ackerman, the idea is that it's a very inclement weather that we have to face on this globe that has brought forth human industry that consequently has changed the climate, and consequently we're increasingly engineering ourselves towards a state of perfectibility once you get into the utopian notion. So there's definitely a lot of cultural biases, ethnic biases that feed into a lot of kind of politicized and militarized distinctions that go along with this. But I do want to emphasize also that at least within, once you get in the hands of someone like Shelley, it lends itself to a kind of radical egalitarianism, so that everybody, in fact, winds up being liberated in Shelley's vision. And we all, around the globe, enjoy, by the end, a kind of modified climate that we can all kind of coexist in with freedom from laws, freedom from religious superstition, and we meet ourselves on this kind of utopian plane. So I don't want to give the impression that this kind of emphasis on climate always leads towards a kind of colonialist or prejudicial perspective. It just to support radical, progressive, and even revolutionary.
Thanks. Anyone else? Well, you have really given us a very different view than we've had the last couple of weeks, which is just fascinating. No, this is really just fascinating. So thank you so much for being with us tonight.
I appreciate it.